Welcome to our video on green mulching using the Bokashi process. People always ask us why use Bokashi as a system when composting can do the same kind of thing. Well, with composting you have to turn it, you have to get heat and water regularly into the pile, where with Bokashi you don't need to do that. It's a non-turn system, reducing harmful emissions, retaining more nutrients, increasing organic matter for your garden, and it's just like an organic fertilizer feeding the soil. Now the process does need other materials to go into the system, so not just the greens and browns that you would normally do with composting. You do need some active ingredients. The two ingredients you see here are Actifirm and Aegea. And you do need to cover it because this is an anaerobic system and not an aerobic system. But the advantage with doing it this way is that you don't have to turn it at all. Now, to do the process, as you can see from the video, we are layering up these amendments. So don't worry too much about the greens and browns. The process itself will work in any ratio. But to get the best results, we want to get to a rough 20:1 carbon to nitrogen ratio. Now, as you see here, this is springtime, so we've got a lot of green grass, but we can also add other things to this system. And one of the big ones you normally find in gardens is weeds. Now, weeds are always an issue because if you don't kill the weed seeds through the process, then they will pop up in other beds that you don't want them in. And you can see things like the knotweed in this video. Now, because we use a low pH in this system, we can actually kill or suppress the weed seeds to be able to do this process, and then when it does go back onto the garden, we can then not worry about the weeds coming back. Now, you also see in this video a pile of food waste. Now, the food waste we're using is again using the Bokashi system, and this Bokashi system has been fermenting for 2 weeks in a sealed unit in an anaerobic system. All our information for the food waste is available on our website. We also wanted to show you the process after a couple of weeks. So because it's a layering system, we can see a layer that's already started to break down, and you can see loads of life in this system. Now the key thing, because you're not moving it, you are relying on that soil contact to get really good breakdown of that organic matter. But we're not reducing the amount of content when we're looking at this process. Normally with a composting system, you would have 100 tons and that would then become 40 tons because most of that process is done with heat, and that heat will then reduce the amount of organic matter, so you get about 40 tons back. With the Bokashi process, we're not reducing that amount of organic matter, so actually we can get back 100 tons from our 100 tons. Now, I appreciate that you have to add some amendments to this process, but because you're adding those amendments, you're controlling the microbial activity, but also increasing the amount of life because you're not turning it. As you can see, when we look at the actual content and the way it holds moisture, this is really good to be able to then process it for a green mulch on your beds. What I love about this process is it can be done gradually. So what we're showing here is a lasagna method. So we're just taking apart and we're just adding to it every time. So this is a load of weeds that we want to process on this system, and we're stacking up nice and high, but making sure that we are putting the Actifirm and the Aegea into each of the processes and making sure it's squished down and then covered on that system. As you can see, it's made quite a result when you look at the amounts of organic content we can then use back onto our garden, creating a waste, but now creating a resource from that waste. As I said, don't be too worried about the amount of carbon to nitrogen ratio. The great thing about this process is you can stack it. Now, when you're diluting the Actifirm, which is the bacteria that we use in this process, you need to roughly get 25 ml of Actifirm per 10 litres of water. If the content is drier and you're using a lot of carbon, it is advisable to add more moisture to the content. This is really important when we're talking about microbes. Microbes don't have legs and they need a way of being able to move and transfer around that system. So while you're feeding them with the nitrogen and the carbon, you also have the ability then to utilize that water to be able to do the whole process. Now, just like a composter system needs heat, air, water and carbon to nitrogen ratio. One of the key ones with any composter system is time. The great thing with a Bokashi system is that you only need to roughly take about 12 weeks worth of time to be able to process it. Now this pile that you see in front of you, this is 14 weeks, so I've left it a little bit longer because we've had a bit more carbon put into the process, but as you can see it's absolutely teeming with life, full of worms and full of life then to put back into the soil. Now one of the things with carbon based products, you can see that the stick snaps and doesn't bend. If you wanted to make this into black gold, then you would have to leave it for longer. But remember that structure is really important for the soil, and especially when you put it onto your beds. Although you feel like it's still a stick, the soil food web will do the work for you, and it will also create some nutrient pockets and some more space in the soil. If you wanted to, you could sieve this and create it into a more of a black gold kind of consistency, but I personally feel that this is really good then as a green mulch onto your beds to create that life back into that soil. Now the further I digged into the pile, you can see the amount of activity. Now most of this activity, to be honest, has been used because of the food waste, and the food waste is really important to add into this process to create that worm activity. So I've finally been able to process the whole amount, and this is what it looks like on the beds. Now those worms don't really like the UV light, so unfortunately they are a little bit worried about being up on the top of the soil, but they'll make their way down very quickly back into the soil structure. As you can see, it doesn't look like black gold, which most people would see as composting, and I appreciate that some people would say that that is not a true compost. But what you'll notice is that with the life that you're creating in that soil structure, you'll gain the results back in respects to growth and the actual yield that you would get from using it onto vegetables. And 6 months later, you can see the results. Beautiful lush lawns, retaining those nutrients, reducing harmful emissions, and a really good way of being able to process your garden waste.